And we have with us the editor of a book called Renewing Faith, Reigniting Faith in Ministry Through Process and Open and Relational Theologies. And for that matter, we have a good many authors uh, in that book with us today who will be introduced by Sheri and who will describe their essays. Now, Sheri is familiar to many of us, and forgive me for simply reading this, but I don't want to leave anything out. Um, Sheri is a theologian, songwriter, and spiritual teacher who draws from wisdom and mystical traditions, relational worldviews, depth psychology, and the intersection of spirituality and science to help people find meaning, belonging, and transformation. She serves as director of Process and Faith with the Center for Process Studies. She's interim minister of Redeemer Lutheran Church in Bradenton, Florida, and teaches regularly for the Hayden Institute and the Claremont School of Theology, from which she earned her doctorate. She's the author of A Process Spirituality, Christian and Transreligious Resources for Transformation, and editor of the book we'll be talking about today. She delivers dynamic presentations to groups and offers courses, concerts, and spiritual retreats. And you can find her online. So without further ado, welcome, Sheri, and thank you so much for joining us and guiding us.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate that introduction, and welcome to all of you who are with us today. What I'm going to do is basically just give a little introduction to this book project that we have in front of us called Renewing Faith. And then there are several of the contributing authors with us today, so I'll call on them to share a little bit about their contribution and maybe even a little bit about how process or open and relational theologies have been renewing for their own faith journeys. So let me share my screen. Okay, so here today to talk about this text, Renewing Faith, for this Process Explorations gathering. And the project actually started back in January of 2025 when we held a conference online called Renewing Faith, and gathered together many of the contributing authors to be on panels to talk about this idea of the renewing of Christian faith, of how the faith itself could be renewed, but how also process and relational, open and relational approaches are renewing for us as individuals, either within faith communities or walking our own faith journeys. So that conference happened in January of 2025. It was a really wonderful experience. We brought in the arts and music and practice and dialogue and all kinds of fun things. And it was just a great experience. And so after that conference, then we, after a couple of months, moved forward with the idea of creating a book called Renewing Faith. And the themes of the conference, we started with kind of keynote opening presentations with Bruce Epperly and myself, just talking about that idea of renewing faith in general. But then we looked at 6 major themes of Christian theology, and we talked about renewing God, renewing Jesus, renewing spirit, renewing message, which had to do mostly with preaching and biblical interpretation, and then renewing worship, and then renewing community, which was both education and outreach. And so those were the themes of the conference, and we carried those same themes into the book itself, and that's how the book is organized. And these are all of the contributing authors. I think there's either 42 or 44. I think it was 44, I'm not sure, but something like that. And, what's funny is initially was working with the folks who had been part of the conference, and there was a period of time where I was panicking because we didn't really have enough people to make a book. So at first I asked a couple of people like Bruce Epperly and Paul Nancaro to write multiple essays for the book, which they did very generously do. And then we ended up, the word got out to Tom Ord and his students. And so next thing I knew, we had probably 30 additional people contact me that they wanted to contribute to this text. And so I'm so grateful to Tom and to all of these people that came forward and were willing to write for this text. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them, or you'll hear about them as they talk, those that are here. But it was a nice mixture of, some people are serving in ministry as clergy, some are spiritual directors or chaplains, some are lay people who maybe they wanted to just study these theologies and did so with Tom. So there's varying perspectives, and people really brought who they were, who they are, into their essays, and which it's a very personal book in many cases, in many ways, and so very moving because of that. So, like I said, these are all the contributors. And the book is available now on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle form. It was published by Sacra Sage for Process and Faith. And so you can go to that first link, which I think Richard is probably going to put in the chat. That's like the landing page for the book itself on the Process and Faith website. And there you can see information about the book as well as some sample pages from the book, if you want to get a little flavor of it. And I'll just mention that right now it is available on Amazon for what we consider our launch price of $14.99. I believe at the end of this month, at the end of November, that will go up to its regular standard price, which it will be at then going forward. So if you want to grab it for a reduced rate, you can do that now, at least to the end of November. So that's all that I wanted to share in my introduction. So why don't we start? Is Bruce still here? Bruce Epperly? There you are. Hey, Bruce, you're in Delaware right now on a beach vacay. So please, just tell us a little bit about your feeling for this text and contributions.
Well, I simply want to begin by saying thank you. Thank you to Sheri for coming up with the idea of this conference, maybe well over a year ago, and asking me to be part of that conference at the time. And thank you to my colleagues in the text. It really is a wonderfully diverse and practical text. And it was a joy to see a handful of former students as authors of chapters. It was a joy to see a colleague, Jay McDaniel, of close to 50 years now. I think we met in 1975. It's hard to believe. Hard to believe. And Paul Nancaro, with whom I've written a book, The Call of the Spirit. John Cobb also was part of that. And people whose work I've appreciated through the years. And certainly, Paul, I'm glad you mentioned your article on Nicaea. It's just a wonderful piece. It's just a wonderful piece and truly is allure. And I thank you, Jay, for posting that. That was really the right piece. I'm writing about the early church for a class I'm teaching in the spring, and it was very helpful to me to reframe a few things. So I'm constantly learning, and I think I ended up with six pieces in this text, and Sheri kept asking me for more, and I was fortunate to have had 45 years of being both in the ministry and as a professor, so I could think about these varied themes of leadership and preaching and faith and worship and healing, and really kind of bring them together. And I think there probably is some common thread. I mean, it's that holds them all together. And it really might have come from a quote from Habakkuk that I've had in one of the articles: write the vision, make it plain. Write the vision, make it plain. Because I guess through my recent career, I've found that for me, as both one who still goes from the pulpit to the classroom to the computer on a regular basis, that theology, spirituality, and witness or practice fit together. You really can't have one without the other. And in recent years, some of my friends who are a bit more traditional than I am theologically have bemoaned the fact in their minds that progressive Christianity puts social action as the horse that's in front of the cart. I believe this text, and I believe the body of my work has basically been that theology and spirituality are the horses that drive social change. That theology and spirituality are the horses that drive social change and our work to witness in the world, and that this has been never more important than now. And this text is a very important text. So if you haven't gotten a text, get the text or get to and share one with a religious leader near you. It's a remarkable text because right now to think of the book of Esther in the Old Testament, we need texts like this, and we need thinking like this for just such a time as this. Just such a time as this, when we're dealing with a social order that's collapsing in many ways. We're dealing with a type of traditional Christianity that sees an authoritarian God that inspires authoritarian leaders, and that has a natural movement from authoritarian scriptures God to leadership. This book provides a really important alternative. It's the alternative that says that theology can be vital. I mean, the one thing that's key, I hope it's in my writing, it certainly is in the other writings, is that this is a vital mission. This is not an armchair discipline we're talking about. We have a vocation here, and at least it was part of mine, to preach in ways that transform lives. We can have lots of questions, but also preach affirmative sermons. I think one of my favorite authors, Madeleine L'Engle, was once asked, "Do you believe without any doubts?" And her response was, "I believe with all my doubts." We don't have to have it all settled to preach an affirmative sermon. People need to hear good theology in a world where there's so much bad theology. People need healing theology. I'm thinking of Howard Thurman, who has influenced me a great deal, who said that bad religion leads to bad behavior. And we're seeing a lot of bad behavior related to bad religion right now. And we can provide a home for people who are searching, as well as empower people in our own churches. There was an article and I read just yesterday about the quiet departure of evangelicals from Trumpism, so to speak. We need to offer alternatives, not the Democratic Party necessarily. No party suits the bill, but alternatives to authoritarian religion, what I call authoritative religion. You can be authoritative without being authoritarian. Authoritative means in your sermons, you've done your homework. You've internalized what you're doing. You preach to the congregation in the concrete time in which you are. You seek healing. So I was glad to have said something about healing here, because healing doesn't just include the stories of Jesus in the Bible and the Gospels, which are very important, but also the healing of communities as well as persons. And some of that occurs through leadership. We know what bad leadership looks like. We see it every day, sometimes even in churches. We see leadership that's fragile, that's defensive, that's misogynist. We see leadership that is unilateral. And the article I believe I wrote on leadership was about Ubuntu leadership. That is leadership from which the leader grows by being part of their leadership process. And finally, worship. And I focused on a small part of worship. I happen to be I'm not the singer that you are, Sheri, or that Jay is. And whenever you're posted on Facebook, I give it a good good listen. Or my wife, Kate, says, oh, Jay McDaniel's singing there. You ought to listen to this. Or Sheri's singing, you ought to listen to this. But hymns have been an important part of my faith. I think you could probably get rid of a lot of theology and just simply sing sometimes. And you know, especially again, I was grateful for Jay's work and the working in memory care units. People remember hymns. People may not remember, they may also remember Elvis Presley, nothing but a hound dog, but they also remember hymns as well. And that the power of a hymn to transform a person's life. And this together, I think all four of the particular essays, and then there was a beginning essay and a little ending essay. All four of them really are that theme that theology matters. And it's our calling right now to speak out, to speak, preach, teach, and write good theology. Spirituality matters. It's our calling to have our churches as laboratories for spirituality. Healing matters. And healing doesn't have to be supernaturalistic. It can be built into the nature of things. As Evie reminds us, art matters. Again, one of my favorite places is the National Gallery in DC, the Smithsonian. It's hard to get to these days, but is the National Gallery to just behold a painting for the afternoon. Leadership matters, leadership that grows rather than contracts. And finally, worship matters, that inspires us and then gets us to get on our feet after we've been sitting in our chairs. So thank you much for asking me, Sheri, and to be part of this. And again, I'm grateful for each one of you that's written pieces in this. And this is a book for sharing. So 2 copies, buy one for yourself, buy one and give it to your pastor if you're not the pastor of the church.
That's for sure. For sure. Thank you, Bruce. That's awesome. And I really loved when you talked at the beginning about justice work, you know, being the cart before the horse. I always say that we can't expect people to live the outer life that Jesus lived if they don't have the inner life that Jesus had. It was Jesus's inner life that fueled his capacity to serve the way he did and love the way he did, in my opinion, anyway. So, yeah.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So, okay, let's hear from some other folks. I'm not going in any particular order, but I'm just kind of as I see your faces here. Why don't we go with Gail Brown? You want to tell us a little bit about what you had to say about prayer?
So I echo everything Bruce said, especially thank you, Sheri, for pulling all of this together. I know what a monumental task that is, and I really appreciate that, and the multifaceted way the book approaches speaking to every aspect of life. My essay was called Bringing Prayer to Life. And that's because one of the ways that process and open relational theologies have influenced me lately has been in my prayer life. They have always influenced me in my teaching and in preaching and spiritual direction. They've been kind of a guiding light in that. But in my prayer life, I don't think they had come to the fullness of what they have come to in the last couple of years. So I want to talk a little bit about how process and open relational theology has influenced my prayer life by starting with kind of the development that I went through in prayer. I started pretty much like most people do in learning to say my prayers. And from that, early in young adulthood, I was introduced to contemplative practices and began to incorporate contemplative prayer as a part of my prayer life. And then when I became the vicar, the priest in charge, and then the rector of a small inner city, historically Black church, I discovered the sacred activism of so many of our Black leaders, like Martin Luther King, like Howard Thurman. That was not just about social change, but was about exactly what Bruce was talking about that when we really engage the gospel and when we really engage the inner and outer life of Jesus and the prophets that we hear about, we have a natural inclination to be moved towards the fact that our lives need to make a difference in the world. So what all of those ways of prayer, though, had in common for me is that they were always things I set aside time to do. Like I set aside time to do my morning prayers or midday prayers and evening prayers and before bed prayers. Probably the morning and the before bed were the ones that I was always most consistent at doing. And I followed a pretty traditional way of saying prayers. The idea of making sure that I included adoration or praise, confession, thanksgiving, supplication in the form of intercession on behalf of others, as well as petitions for myself. And I set aside time to do contemplative practices like centering prayer. And I tried to set aside time also to be involved in social activism, things like participating in marches for justice, things like participating with some of the local activists here around Knoxville, Tennessee, who were working on giving a voice to the voiceless. And those things were really important and still are. But they all had to do, in my mind, with setting aside time to do them, rather than seeing them as integral to the ordinary moment by moment things like my conversations with my husband or with my children or with my colleagues. I mean, there were the things I did that were prayer, and they were varied to include not only words, but also contemplation and action. But there were the things that were specific that I set aside. And I think as I, in the last 2 or 3 years, began to do, as I revisited some of the process theology that I had learned in seminary and was introduced to Tom Oord's way of talking about open and relational theologies, which I had drawn from but never really had a name for, like incarnational theologies and Anglicanism, and since I'm an Episcopal priest, and liberation theologies, and Black theologies, and all sorts of theologies like that. I didn't have like an umbrella term. So my thoughts about what prayer might be began to change and to shift. There was a renewal in how I thought about prayer. And to me, that was part of the renewing faith that this book speaks so eloquently about. And there were kind of 3 parts in terms of prayer that happened for me, that open and relational theologies and process theologies really sort of nudged me towards. One was a reminder, one was an epiphany, and one was a personal goal. The reminder was that we don't live life in set apart moments that are disconnected from the other moments. That life is an ever-flowing process of experience that happens moment to moment, as one moment becomes and then transitions and fades away and moves to another moment, but carries everything with it. And so I began to question, why then is prayer something separate that I go off and do? Why is it not more integrated with my moment by moment living? And so that was sort of the first little crack in that began to let the light in. The epiphany was beginning to think of prayer not so much as an activity to set aside time for, but simply as a way of living life in a different way, of being able to bring the same kind of invitation to God to influence me, and the same openness of mind and body and spirit to let God influence me, that I included in my prayers when I set aside time for prayer, to try to bring that to the moment by moment living of my day, to be able to pause in a moment when there was an interaction, and to use that whole body, mind, present openness to the influence of God, and learn to rewire my brain somewhat to think differently about how I experienced and listened and heard God through just insights and nudges in any given moment, not just those moments when I had gone through the process of let me pray, or the process of being aware of the presence of God, or the process of committing to this form of social activism, but thinking of all of those things as being integrated. And so my personal goal became to intentionally practice that. And this was about 2 years ago, that I started trying not only to do my set-aside times, because those are incredibly important. You can't do the other without them. But that when I left those set-aside times, when I said the amen to the word prayers, or when I said the let it be to the contemplative prayer at the end, or when I said, may I do the work you've given me to do, when I did an action, to kind of bring that sense to every moment. If it was cooking dinner, if it was talking with somebody, if it was planning liturgy, if it was getting ready to preach, but just sometimes if it was in the grocery store and I saw, and I greeted the clerk. She didn't have to look harried or anything like that. Just that this was another person, and this was another opportunity to interact with that person in a way that incorporated those aspects of prayer that invite God in, that opened our mind to the nudges, and that then respond with action. And I discovered over
Hey, Gail,
the 2
Gail,
yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we need to keep moving we've
okay,
got several authors that are going to speak a few
okay.
words.
So
So
anyway,
yeah, sorry.
the experience of doing that led me to write the article and write the book. And so the idea of the book is really to be able to put forth looking at prayer through the eyes of open and relational theology, and also then how to do that by beholding and befriending life day by day.
Great. Beautiful. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Gail. That was a really great essay that you contributed, and your book is also very excellent. I highly recommend that. I served on Gail's dissertation committee, so that was a great experience. Okay, so maybe let's go to Jeff Wells now. Yeah, was hoping each contributor that's here could take about 2 minutes and just share a little bit. And if we've got more time, it's because I know there'll be questions from the general public attendees. So, but Jeff, why don't you go next?
Yeah, sure.
Jeff
Thanks.
wrote in the section on community and talked about collaborative worship planning and stuff like
Right.
that.
Right. Thank you. My essay was titled, or is titled, Shaping Open Relational Collaborative Community. And so I was focusing on the whole process of how the Church of the Village, where I served until June of this year, had evolved to become a congregation that had completely embraced open and relational and process theology as its primary theological lens. It was a very exciting process over the course of 6 years. And of course, it helped a lot that it was already identified itself as a progressive, inclusive, and anti-racist Christian community. But I'll say that just a couple of things about that whole process, and I think the ways that became incorporated in the sense of collaborative community in particular, because I think that when we first began the process, it was focused on worship and preaching, but it eventually became part of the whole way that we thought of how we organized ourselves as a community together. And so I think I want to add to Bruce's list of the things that are important, that community is very important, and relationship, of course, in relational theology, is very important. And open and relational and process theology helped this community to really value in a deeper way our connection to God by understanding that God is in all of us and we are in God, and that we are all deeply connected with one another and all of the cosmos, right? But especially all other creatures on the planet. So ultimately, that became joined with a big emphasis on ecological civilization and the need to transform human society, which we already recognized on a social justice level for human beings, but then the congregation expanded its understanding significantly to the life of all living beings. But in the specific ways that it shaped collaborative community, I'll give you the best example that I have, which is that in the process of identifying and developing new leaders in the congregation in what we called the nominations committee. It changed dramatically from a perspective of kind of looking at the slots that needed to be filled and saying, who are we going to get to do these things, to a process of really thinking about every member of the congregation, and often each year kind of interviewing all of the new people in the congregation to not ask them to do anything, but to simply understand who they were, what their gifts were, or in some cases help them identify gifts that they didn't recognize in themselves, and to develop those. And instead of just plopping somebody into a position, we created this whole mentoring process where the person who was in a position of a chair of a particular committee would mentor somebody who was already being prepared to take over that position the following year. And that kind of collaborative and relational process, I think, wouldn't have happened without our theological perspective having already changed to being open and relational. I also just wanted to say how I think that this book comes at a very important time and in a very important context. And I think it's important for us to recognize that things that I see are, for one, what feels like a revival of process and faith. And that's thanks to Sheri and Leslie King and Al Gephardt and others that is happening. I think that's very important. I think the large movement and following for open and relational theology, inspired by Tom Oord and the Center for Open and Relational Theology, is another expression of that. The several books that have come out, a reissue of The Call of the Spirit by John Cobb, Paul Nancaro, and Bruce Epperly in 2022, and then the book You Never Preach from the Same Pulpit Twice by Ron Allen was very timely. That also came out in 2022. And then the book that I helped put together with Tom Oord and Vicki Randall, who's here today, and Nicole Torbitsky, Preaching the Uncontrolling Love of God. Those resources, I think, are so important for what I believe are the hundreds of churches that are either already doing this, whether it's explicit or not, or would be very open to it if they knew about it. So I think that we have such a big opportunity right now. The other thing that happened that I think highlighted that for me was the Open and Relational and Process Theology Conference that happened in Charlotte, North Carolina in September, which drew 150 people. We were expecting more like 60 people to register for it, and it just far exceeded expectations and was a really, really powerful experience. So I think it's a very hopeful sign for the movement of open, relational, and process theology that these things are all kind of coming together now. Anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, that's all great information. And from when we began the project on the Renewing Faith book, I really saw it as a companion book to especially the Preaching the Uncontrolling Love of God book that had come out a year before or so. And so, yeah, so if you want to give a second gift to your clergy leader in your community or to other faith leaders in your community, both of these books would be very welcome, probably, from them. So thanks, Jeff. How about Al? I heard Jeff mentioned Al's name. Why don't we go to Al and then to Leslie?
Well, in the book, I have the privileged position of being situated between Jeff on the left hand and Bruce on the right hand. So thank you, Sheri, for putting me in that place. My particular vision for the article in the book was how to communicate what process and open and relational theology is all about to a community of faith. Yes, we can have classes, and yes, it weaves its way into preaching. But what we came up with was the whole idea of taking a whole month and focusing around a theme and letting the media itself become the message, involving youth and children and adults, um, uh, setting free the artists in the community to focus on a theme. And so I focused in the article on one of these months. And the article is Opening Windows to the World. And during these months, sometimes we focused on a part of the world. Sometimes we focused on another faith tradition. We had one that we called Shema, Shabbat Shalom. And we connected with the Jewish community. We borrowed from their worship resources and their music. And there was a cantor that came one Sunday with a Torah, and during a children's moment, with his yad, he's reading from the Torah, and the kids are just, wide-eyed, what's going on here? At the time of the Iraq War, we had a month that we called Desert to Desert, and because we live in Phoenix, and we chose that time to focus to connect with our Muslim community here in Tempe. And but what I wrote about in the book was a month that we called the Unavoidable Challenge, and it was about faith and science. And it began with an adult education study of a book by Ian Barbour on science and faith, in which he looks at 4 different ways that these two approaches have interacted with each other. And when he talks about integration, he opens the door to process thought. So that was a kind of an introduction. And then the month, we walked into the sanctuary, there were planets suspended from the ceiling, and there were charts over on the wall that depicted cell development and the evolutionary development of Homo sapiens. And so there was a lot of visual. We started with a hymn by Thomas Traeger on, what was it called? Praise the Source of Faith and Learning. And it pictures 2 rivers that are often kind of in contrast and, fighting each other. But the hymn pictures these rivers coming together and somehow becoming one. And then we had 4 different themes during that month that were addressed by scientists and guest speakers, and times in people's homes where we just had open discussion and exploring different aspects of the tension and the collaboration between faith and science. And in my mind, this was an attempt to try, through the whole media becoming the message, of communicating to my congregation what process perspective was all about. And I'll just end with there was one young person, I think 10 years old, on last Sunday of the month, who got dressed early to come to church. 7 o'clock in the morning, she presented herself in her parents' bedroom. And
she had done her hair up in two different styles, and she had two different socks on and two different shoes, and and um I don't know, there were 4, 5, 6 different things that she had done that had this sort of duality. And her parents said, what are you doing? And she just looked at them and she said, there's faith and there's science. And she said, and yet they're one. I thought, well, it had been a successful month. So that was it.
You can't get better than that, right, Al?
That's right.
Puts it all right there in a nutshell. Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Leslie, why don't you come on next? Leslie contributed, one of the things Leslie did for the conference was teach morning yoga and other body practices. We were getting at the somatic aspect of spirituality. And then she also participated in a panel on renewing message. So her essays, one was on Bible and one was on body. So Leslie, why don't you?
That's really great. And I think that's largely sufficient, Sheri, really. I mean, the somatic practice of the body really looked at fascia and did a strong comparison with extensive continuum and connection. And fascia flossing is a trend to gently open and increase the capacity of the body. And I really found strong correlation to Whitehead. And then quite simply, the second article was leaning into Otto Schwarmer's theory U presencing model and how to recognize depth in the scripture according to our longing to kind of investigate it. So one chapter offers a chair yoga sequence to sort of experience some of Whitehead's philosophy. And then the second chapter offers a way to explore the parable of the prodigal son. And it was a lot of fun to do it, Sheri. So thanks a bunch.
Thank you, Lizzie. Yeah, when we planned the conference, we weren't sure if people would want to come earlier than the sessions, the speaking sessions, to do anything bodily. And they did. They did. We had a good number of people every morning. They're looking to experience what you did. And we also had a couple of, one evening we had kind of a spiritual dancing, getting into or moving our bodies and feeling our bodies and experiencing the world through our bodies. So it was a great event. And Leo did post a link. We are still offering access to the conference recordings for a much reduced price from the conference price. So if you're interested in that, portions, the speaking panels and all that are available there. So thank you, Leslie. I appreciate that. Let's see. How about next we go to Paul Nancaro?
All right. Thank you, Sheri. And
Yeah.
as others have said, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this and to be part of the book and the conference before it. It's been marvelous. I got a particular interest in using the tools of process theology, especially Whiteheadian metaphysics, to kind of open up, to unearth, to revitalize traditional and ancient texts and practices. I was raised in the Episcopal Church, cradle Episcopalian, and I remember as a very young child being deeply moved by the experience of the liturgy. Worship in church was something mystical and something beyond ordinary, and yet there was very little language available to me as a child or even as a teenager or even as a young adult to talk much about where that dynamism was coming from, right? And so I got very interested in that sort of thing from an early age, and I've tried to pursue that through process theology and through ministry as a priest of the Episcopal Church. So when I do the liturgy, I want it not just to be the recitation of an old text, but to be something that's obviously emerged out of vital, vibrant, life-giving religious spiritual experience and will flow into new religious and spiritual experience for the people participating. So with that kind of framework, I contributed 3 essays to the book. One of them is on renewing the notion of God as creator. And it ends up being sort of a close reading of Genesis 2, of the creation story in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, not just as a static recitation of fixed days of 24 hours in which certain indelible things happened, no, but looking at that story as an unfolding of differentiation and relationship. so that there's a whole dynamism to it, and each of the days flows out of what was accomplished and satisfied in the previous day. And by reading it that way, it may be able to develop a sense of differentiation and relationship and creativity in the reader and in the congregation as well. Second essay is on the Holy Spirit and the practice of discernment, trying to look at some of the New Testament witness to the Holy Spirit, get back behind some of the kind of static arguments about the persons of the Trinity and the roles they have and the metaphysics of threeness and oneness, but the way the New Testament speaks of the Spirit as experiential, as activating activities and experiences within us and within communities. And then how can we take that sort of understanding into a renewed practice of discerning the spirits so that we become more aware of how God is at work within our thoughts and actions and moving us forward, and be intentional about that awareness and responsive to God through discernment. And then a third essay on liturgy in particular, which is my root interest. But then again, looking at the traditional gestures and texts of liturgy as a series of experiences that are designed to bring the congregation into a shared work of receiving and offering, so that we are aware of what we are receiving from each other and from the world and from God, and we become more aware of how we put that together and offer back to each other and to God and to the world action that is in the mode of Jesus, action that is Christ-like. And so those are the 3 essays that I've got in this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Much appreciated. Well, you had written you wrote both about God and spirit. Why don't we go to Vicki Randall, who wrote about Jesus, and let's hear from her, and then maybe we can go to Tracy Tucker next.
All right. Thank you. I want to thank Sheri also for this opportunity that came at, I think for many of us, kind of this strange moment that we find ourselves in. The previous opportunities that have come from Tom and from Jeff Wells to write and share in open and relational theology have come at a time when I was more settled, when I had just retired from 35 years of ministry and had things that I had been percolating for a long time, where I felt fairly defined that I could write on in the field. This opportunity came, as I guess for many of us, at such a chaotic time in my life when things felt such a messy middle. At first, I even said no the first time the invitation came, because I just felt way too overwhelmed by all that was happening in the world to think and speak theologically into that. But Tom in particular encouraged me to keep thinking about it, and so that the writing kind of came out of this messy middle, much more than the settled theology in some of my other writing. I was living this summer in Los Angeles, where I've lived for 68 years. And I was living in Los Angeles when it was militarized and when all of the chaos that we've seen in our large urban cities, with the military being called in and the National Guard being called in, and all of that happening all around us and right in our backyard. I also was transitioning from ministry in the PCUSA church to now participating for the last 2 years in a Mennonite congregation, which has a very defined view of power and resistance and justice work that was just super empowering and helpful. And the way of reading scripture, the Mennonite way of reading scripture, Jesus-centered hermeneutic, fits so well with open and relational theology, and looking at how does our resistance reflect the way Jesus responds in moments like these. So that was what I was more struggling almost on a personal level, or not even almost on a personal level, was struggling with a personal level. So the chapter is about that, about sacred resistance. What does it look like? What does power look like? What does resistance look like? How are we speaking and caring for the immigrants among us, the marginalized among us? The same time I was moving for the first time from Los Angeles to British Columbia, changing countries, going through the immigration process, all of that process of becoming an outsider. So all of those kind of issues were kind of in the messy middle that I'm writing from. So it might be not as finished as some other things that I've written, but maybe speaking to this moment of where we're all wrestling with those issues of what does power look like? What does resistance look like? How is Jesus calling us to be authentic and faithful in this moment? And letting all of that be shaped by our view of Jesus and this uniquely open and relational view of Jesus and the way that Jesus shows power that is so different from everything else that we're hearing, and even the view of Jesus that we're hearing proclaimed so loudly. So that's what my chapter is about: sacred resistance, and struggling in that.
Great, thank you, Vicki. That was. I'm so glad that you were able to say yes, even in the chaos.
Yeah.
We're very, very thrilled that were able to contribute to the book. Thank you. Okay, well, Tracy Tucker is a chaplain, and so he wrote about talking about language at the end of life. So, Tracy, why don't you talk a little bit about that and what you find to be renewing about these theologies?
Right. Well, this my story takes me back several years to before I became a part of that group that Tom Ord has of students working on through Northwind Seminary. I was reading a book and dealing with some life experiences, life challenges. My daughter had just come out. And I was transitioning or had transitioned from several decades in the church to full-time chaplaincy in a large hospice. And I found what I needed in that I needed language that spoke. And language is a series of sounds and gestures and expressions that we employ to understand and communicate meaning. And I had all these senses and intuitions and feelings about things, and I needed a language to help communicate that, and open and relational theology gave me that language. And so, as several people here today have already expressed, um, there's a language and how we speak about what we say, what we're convinced of, how we preach, and so forth. My preaching context right now is um, a chapel at a retirement village. It's kind of a larger retirement village, and they're a very eclectic group. Everything from people who are confirmed atheists to all sorts of folks on the Christian, particular religious spectrum. And I have a chance to hang out with these people on a weekly basis and try to present, some kind of a sense of hope and a place for them to land spiritually. And there's not a consistent theme that runs through the crowd, so I have to speak kind of broadly, which fits because I work as in end of life kind of work, and I just was with someone today who is a veteran for a decade, and he gave a lot of himself to the military and supporting and caring for his nation and all this kind of thing. And we recognized him today. Yesterday, I visited with a former veteran who had a different experience. He came away from the military and went and found his refuge in bottles and drugs. And so he died this morning, and I had a chance. I've had a chance to bump shoulders with a variety of different people, and what I find is that the commonality between most of these people is the way that we talk um, about end of life, and sometimes the way we don't talk about end of life. A lot of folks get to the end of their existence here on earth, and all of a sudden their faith means something different. They maybe recall back to earlier in their life when they were a part of a faith community and they've gotten away from that, but now end of life, they're wanting to get back to it. And there's some language that kind of gets in the way a lot of times. And for folks that aren't so advanced in age, but are still finding themselves either at the end of their life or sitting with someone at the end of their life, someone they love, someone they've cared for. And the language often is difficult. And an example of that is the way that we talk about the matters of heaven and hell. We like heaven, that's a good place. Hell, not so much. And the language that people use reflects some thinking that's really just often not helpful. Even the best parts of talking about like heaven. Had an experience where someone was an older person had died, and a younger person, their relative, I think it was a grandchild, said, that someone had heard someone say to her about, well, at least your grandma's in a much better place now. And the little child was traumatized. Heaven wasn't a good place. It's where my grandma went. It can't be with me anymore. And so, how we talk about these things, sometimes we do so without really thinking through the implications of our words. And though there's talking about hell is even more problematic, but I'll kind of move past that and talk about how we translate that language into our meaning for God. In my context, it's very common for me to hear someone say, well, ultimately, we just got to leave this up to God. Professionals, doctors, nurses, they often live with that kind of language. Well, we're just going to trust that God knows what he's doing. Well, that's not a very satisfying way of thinking about things when we ascribe our sense of what's not good, our loss, our grief, our pain, when we ascribe that to God, and that becomes God's fault because God took my loved one. God took that person. And that kind of language is challenging. And so in my article, I challenge us to think through that. Um, Especially when we have a deterministic way of saying these kinds of things. So that now we've decided that God's the one who says when we're going to come and when we're going to go, when we're going to die and who's going to die and in what way. I try to spell this out even more clearly in my book, but in this essay, I just challenge us to think in terms of what were some better ways of communicating so that we're not blaming God for evil, not blaming God for untimely, we think, death. I mean, we've decided that death is 100%. Everybody's going to die. But how is it or how can we talk about this in such a way that we're not saying, well, God had a plan, and now that plan involves taking your mommy away, or that plan involves taking your child, and so that's really the heart of what I'm driving at in my article and encourage us. Anna Case Winters wrote this: "When we suffer, God suffers. God is in, with, and for us in our situation of suffering. It could even be said that in our suffering, God suffers more deeply than we do. God knows and experiences the full extent of what we suffer from external causes. And so if we can transition from an idea of a God who causes or has planned death and dying to a God who in fact joins us in whatever our experience is and walks through that with us. Or as Alfred North Whitehead is so frequently quoted as saying, that God becomes the fellow sufferer who understands, who's present with us, who sits in the ashes with Job, and is that constant source of encouragement because of God's presence. And so when I'm praying with my patients that will allow me to pray with them and who come from an orientation where this would be appropriate, I might say something like, "Gracious Lord, sit with us in our pain, sit with us in our sense of loss, and help us to know that we're not alone, but that the one who loves us and knows us best is present with us in our time of suffering and need," and try to promote that kind of language. And so that's what I've that's helped me and what I've tried to put in this book. And by the way, Sheri, thank you. You put me at the very last essay before Bruce's summary at the end. But it was an honor to be a part of the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Much appreciated. Appreciate your essay and all that you've done. Let's next hear from Tim Miller, and then we'll go to Elvie, and then John Paul, and then I think we'll go to Jay McDaniel to make a few comments, and then so Tim, why don't you talk to us? You also wrote about prayer.
Process theology has definitely renewed my faith, especially my faith in prayer. As a Catholic kid, I thought pre-meal prayers of gratitude like, "Thank you, God, for the food we eat," were absurd. Farmers grew the food and stores sold it to us. And petitionary prayers seemed no less crazy. "Give us this day our daily bread." Again, I thought we'd do better asking the farmers and shopkeepers. And then there was, "Lead us not into temptation." We have to ask God not to tempt us? And giving God a list of things we want and asking for them, why? God already knew our wants and needs, and did we think we could convince the Lord of the universe to give us stuff just by asking? Worst of all were prayers of praise. Did God really want us telling him how great he is? Did he need us to make him feel worthwhile? It just seemed ridiculous. And yes, I did think of God as he and him back then. After evolving spiritually in all kinds of ways as a teenager and adult, including a stint in atheism, I encountered process theology and open and relational theology. They changed faith for me in a number of ways, but prayer was one of the main ones. I learned that God nudges and draws and inspires us and all reality in an unceasing attempt to entice every process to a state of ultimate beauty, goodness, value, and flourishing. And we get to participate in that. We get to co-create with God. So prayers of gratitude make sense. God is drawing us to maximal value and flourishing. Thank you, God, and thank you, everyone else who helps pull us onward and upward. Petitionary prayers make perfect sense now. They're one way we do our part to draw reality towards the sublime. Along with our thoughts and feelings and actions, they are how we are privileged to co-create. Co-creational prayers, I like to call them now. Prayers of praise. Well, God has done a fabulous job so far, but things are still very rough at times. God and all of us have so much more to do. The struggle can get daunting. A little gratitude and encouragement are ours to give to both God and our fellow co-creators. So that's the kind of stuff I wanted to contribute to this beautiful book.
Thank you, Tim. That's really beautiful. I appreciate what you wrote, and all of the perspectives were just so unique and varied and just so important. Thank you, Tim. So let's go to Elvie. Elvie was our artist in residence for the Renewing Faith Conference. We actually used 3 of her paintings, her images, as targets of contemplation during the conference, which was really beautiful. And so Elvie wrote a little bit about the use of aesthetics in faith communities. Why don't you go ahead, Elvie?
Okay. Well, what I wrote about is that works of art are messages from the unseen and are close to God. And the arts really are the best ways to have feeling, especially nowadays with AI that doesn't have any feeling. And all these years, I drew, I have an arts degree too, and I drew realistically. I could draw beautifully since I was in 7th grade. I could really draw. And the more I went away from the likeness of that drawing, the more feeling it came, because it was the getting away from the likeness of the drawing that I was doing that made the feeling. And so then I started realizing that abstract art could actually give more feelings. And because it was less likely like the drawing that was more like a discursive mode, words, it was words. And painting abstractly is all feelings and emotions. And so you could draw this out so that people could see these and feel these drawings more. And it's almost like going to an orchestra that doesn't have any words. But boy, when you come out of hearing all of those sounds without words and walk out of that auditorium or that situation, I mean, your feelings are really intense, and there wasn't any words involved with it. It was all musical feelings. And so I could really see that feelings were there and that aesthetics were very important. And then when I got involved with Whitehead, I mean, he's really into aesthetics and feelings, and rather than the discursive, which was the likeness of something, which was fine, then you could make the feelings come in by departing from that likeness and putting your feelings into that. So I've really gotten involved in that, and my shows and everything, my artist statements and the show statements bring process philosophy in with my art.
Yeah, and LV, you also have a Master of Divinity, and
Right.
so I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you could envision bringing more feeling into worship through bringing in the arts.
Yeah, you need to bring the people that are interested in art. I mean, every community has artist type people in it, and so they're left out of everything. So if you bring them in and let them speak, print a painting in the bulletin, have art shows, and let their feelings come out and show. And I mean, that would bring them into the community of the church so much more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, LV.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's go to John Paul Sidnor. Don Paul, where are you?
Thanks, everybody. I wasn't sure if I could make this meeting, so I want to thank Sheri for including me at the very last second. I appreciate your flexibility. My contribution to the book, and generally my contribution to process theology in general, is very dependent on the social trinity. And I'm an ordained pastor, and I'm married to an ordained pastor. So my theology is very pastoral. It's very ecclesiastical. It's really coming from the church, and it's for the church. And basically what I think the church is supposed to do is to articulate social Trinitarian relationships, loving relationships through time. So time is the blessing through which we love one another. Time is the blessing through which we complete one another. Time is the blessing through which we experience the moment by moment progression of time becomes the grace by grace love of God. So if we're going to be in loving relationship, as the Trinity is in loving relationship with one another, three persons united through love into one God, then we are going to need to relate to one another through time. Relationship only has meaning if the related parties are changing one another. And that change only happens through time by definition. And if this change is loving, if it's productive, if it's growing, then time becomes kairos, or time is blessed. So eternity is not timelessness. Eternity is time as blessed, or kairos. So what we're moving toward, which gives time direction and purpose, is the kingdom of God, which is the reign of love. And in the reign of love, which was described by Jesus Christ, all relations are Trinitarian relations. That is, we are called to love one another into divine community as the Trinity loves one another into divine community, because we are made in the image of God, in this case, especially God, the Trinity. So I'm trying to, in my work, in my pastoral work and theological work, reclaim time as a better mode of existence than timelessness, reclaim material change through time as blessed, reclaim our embodiment and our combination of body and spirit as blessed, and allowing for growth through time, so that eventually what we find is that becoming is better than being. And so God, I would conceptualize God not as the ground of being, but as the ground of becoming itself. And God is loving relationality itself as Trinity. It's basically my contribution to the book, very Trinitarian, very pro time, and very pro matter and pro embodiment.
Great. Thank you so much, John Paul. Now I just but Jay, why don't you say a little bit about your contribution, which was about the Spirit? I thought it was a really unique perspective.
Well, thank you. I think that my contribution can seem very odd, because my thesis was that the Spirit of God is like plasma, and plasma not as blood, but plasma as the fourth state of matter. And I don't know if you know, but now the idea that there are only three states of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, that's no longer the case. There's a fourth state of matter. It's called plasma. And for that matter, there are other states of matter. But I was intrigued with the idea of plasma as a metaphor for how the Spirit is actually at work in our lives and in the world. Because plasma is not solid. It's not even liquid. It's not even gas. And yet it's everywhere, and you can feel it. And this takes me to Elvie's idea that I think that the Spirit is actually something you feel and then only later think about. And that's important to me because the context in which I work, sometimes the language of open and relational theology, the language of process theology really doesn't work. And yet they feel the presence of the Spirit as understood in a process context. So let me explain those contexts. I am an oblate, a lay associate in a Benedictine community in Fort Smith, Arkansas. My friends at the monastery, there's about 23 of them. They're all over 80. They have been living lives of service and prayer for years and years and years. Politically, they're some of the most liberal people I've ever met. They pray 3 times a day and do service. But theologically, for me to go there and say, by the way, did you know that God is not all powerful? That just wouldn't work. That's not their language. That's not where they are. So I need to learn to find the presence of God in experience, not just in theology. And I tell you, in terms of experience, do they think that the whole of life has intrinsic value? Yes, they do. Do they think that beauty is a way of finding the divine? Yes, they do. Do they think that we should live in community and be humble about it and not lord over others? Yes, they do. Uh, and I began to realize with them, I need to uncouple the language of process theology from what I would call the experience of process theology. I experienced it in another context too. I experience it with my friends who are Buddhist. I have many friends in my area that are Buddhist. And again, the idea of God doesn't work for them. but they're not angry. Their spirituality is a sense of interconnectedness, a sense of listening. Listening is key for them, to live a listening life, and to know that life is moment by moment. And you need to let go, not just hold on. Are they processing spirit? Yes, they are. But I can't go to them with open and relational evangelism. I can't say, have I got an idea of God for you? And by the way, they're not battling against an angry, wrathful God. It's not that battle. That's not their battle. So I could go on and on. I work with people with Alzheimer's and their families. And like Tracy, I see a lot of death. I've got to meet them where they are. I've got to let them use their language. And sometimes, and I don't know if Tracy's still here, sometimes when they say, uh, it's all in God's hands, they don't mean God caused it. They mean that whatever happens gets folded into God's life. I don't know why it happened, but somehow it gets folded into God's life. Well, if you know Whitehead, you know that's Whitehead. That's the consequent nature of God. But I would never use that phrase. But I say, yeah, I'm with you. May that be. May that be. Here's a fourth group, and I'm just naming constituencies, and then I'll stop. Have you ever heard of, I'm almost being facetious here. Do you remember the Charlie Kirk memorial service in Arizona? Do you remember the tens of thousands of people that were there? Does process theology have anything for them? How? What? How will it be communicated? Must they rid themselves of the idea that God is all powerful in order to have access to process theology? So I think we care about all those people. I know you do. I do. You care about Benedictine sisters. You care about Buddhists. You care about people with Alzheimer's. And you care about the thousands and thousands of people in our country who seek meaning. And they will find it however they can find it. And who can blame them? So how can the process movement and the theme of this book that Sheri pulled together and the themes that are important to all of you and to me, do we need to be relevant to those constituencies? And if so, how does that happen? I think that's my question.
Thanks, Jay. That's great. Before we go to open for questions, I do see that Carl. I just want to give Carlton a minute or two to talk a little bit about. He wrote about I think about the adventure of faith, and so why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Hi. Sorry I'm late. We are getting our sewer redone in the house. And so it's there's going to be a mess, maybe tomorrow, maybe Friday. And there's going to be potential of not having an even bigger mess once we find out that it's completely collapsed the line one day in January when everything's frozen solid. So letting go of the attempt to have omnipotence over my life and realizing that everything happens and, to use a good process, shit happens. And in this case, we don't want to keep it in the house. And everything flows. Hopefully we can get on board with that flow of reality. So it's good to be with you. And I just basically in mind told a little bit about my story and about how process for me enabled me to find a picture and a vision of God in the chaos that I experienced, without having to hang a lot of blame on the one who journeyed with me through it all. Because in the upbringing I had was in a quite a conservative rural congregation here, and many of our little rural congregations here in Saskatchewan, in the wilds of the country, some of them with only having a dozen people still active, going into a big technical and theological discussion is something that has to be done very slowly, very gently, because they're in a world that hasn't really shifted a lot in a long time in terms of the world of ideas. But I still come from a very process-oriented understanding, because that's enabled me to hold on to faith and to a concept of God that works within what I've experienced. And I'm currently working on a dissertation that's folding together Whitehead and Don Miguel Ruiz, the author of the Four Agreements. And it's fun, because to use a Whiteheadian title, it's an adventure of ideas. I'm seeing how these ideas collide, and where they harmonize, where they may have some dissonance, and where hopefully a melody line can be found leading through the whole thing. And even more importantly, we're talking about plasma and a feel, a sense of groove, that there can be a groove and a rhythm that allows life to go on. There we go.
Great.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you, Carlton. We appreciate your being here today, and appreciate your contribution for sure. Jay?
Thanks so much to Sheri, to John Paul, to everybody that's offered something, and to everybody that's listened in. So,
Yes, thank you for being here, and thank you for allowing us to share.
Peace be with everybody.